The grave marker was smaller than I'd expected. Plain gray stone, no ornamentation, just a name and 2 dates carved simply into the face of it. The kind of stone that tells you almost nothing about a person beyond the bookends of their existence. I'd parked at the cemetery gate and walked in alone, past rows of graves I didn't look at, and I'd found it the same way I'd found everything else about this. Too late, with my hands shaking slightly, not quite believing I was standing where I was standing. White chrysanthemums in the metal holder at the base. Fresh, no more than a few days old, because I'd been here 2 weeks earlier to leave them myself. The first time in 62 years that anyone other than my father had left flowers at this grave. I stood there in the November cold and looked at her name, and thought about my father, and thought about everything I'd found in the weeks since he died, and tried to decide what to do with the fact that I still couldn't feel anything clearly. I was 62 years old. That's a long time to have a birthday without knowing what else it was. My father's name was Robert. Bob, to almost everyone. He was a deliberate, unhurried man. A high school history teacher for 31 years. The kind of teacher whose students came back, years later, to tell him he'd changed something for them. Which I know because I watched it happen more than once. A grown adult showing up at our door on a summer evening looking both nervous and grateful, and my father standing in the hallway looking mildly embarrassed by the whole thing. The way he always was when someone thanked him for something he'd decided was simply his job. He had a quality that I've spent most of my adult life trying to understand and still haven't quite managed. An absolute consistency. The same in every room. The same with every person. No version of himself that was different behind closed doors from the one he showed in public. I used to think that was a straightforward virtue. Now I think it's more complicated than that. Now I think there are things a man can carry with complete consistency, so quietly and so completely, that the people closest to him never once see the weight. He married my mother, Joan, when they were both 24. She taught 4th grade. He taught high school history. They lived in the same town their whole lives and raised one child, me. In a red brick house with a garden that my mother kept and my father occasionally helped with, meaning he stood at the edge of it in his weekend clothes and made suggestions she mostly ignored. They were, by any measure I had available to me growing up, a happy couple. Not demonstratively so, not the kind of couple who hold hands in public or finish each other's sentences, but happy in the deeper and less visible way, the kind of happiness that runs underneath a life like a current you don't notice until the day it isn't there. My mother died when I was 40, a cancer diagnosis, 8 months from the first scan to the last morning, and my father, after her death, became quieter in a way that I'd always attributed to grief. The ordinary narrowing of a man who'd lost the person his life was organized around. He lived alone for 22 more years, in the same red brick house, and we spoke every Sunday, and I drove to see him most months. And if I'd been asked, at any point in those 22 years, whether there was anything significant about my father that I didn't know, I would have said no without hesitation. I would have been wrong. My birthday has always been in mid-October, a date I've never thought much about. One of those birthdays that falls in what feels like the middle of everything, between seasons, between school terms, the kind of date that photographs well in autumn light. Growing up, my birthdays were modest by design. My parents were not extravagant people, and I don't mean that as a criticism, only that the celebrations tended toward the intimate rather than the showy. A cake my mother made herself, usually chocolate with white icing, a few friends. Sometimes a small present my father would produce from somewhere at the end of the evening with the slightly embarrassed air of a man who found gift-giving awkward but understood it was required. What I remember most about my childhood birthdays is not any particular gift or any particular year, but the constancy of my father at them, his presence at the table, his quiet participation in whatever the occasion required. He was always there for the lunch, always there for the cake, and he always left at about 3 o'clock. Always with the same easy explanation, errands to run, things to sort out on the drive home, and I'd wave him off from the doorway and go back inside without thinking much about where those errands took him. It didn't occur to me to think about it. It was just what he did. I was 35 the first time I followed him. My birthday, mid-October, a Thursday that year, and my father had come to our house for lunch, the way he always did on my birthday, because my mother had started the tradition when I was small and my father had continued it after she died, driving the 40 minutes from his house to mine every year on that date, for cake and lunch and whatever small celebration we'd arranged. He stayed until about 3, and then he said what he always said, that he had some errands he needed to run on the way home, and kissed my wife on the cheek and shook hands with my son and drove away. I'd always accepted the errands. My father ran errands. That's what he said. and so I'd never thought very hard about it. Except that year. I can't tell you exactly why that year was different, only that something made me watch the car disappear down the road, and then keep standing at the window for a moment after it had gone, and then, without entirely planning to, put on my own coat and get in my own car and follow him. I kept enough distance that I don't think he ever saw me. He drove not toward the shops, not toward any errand I could identify, but out along the county road toward the edge of town, and then down a smaller road I didn't use much, and then through the open gates of a cemetery I'd been to maybe twice in my life, for funerals of people I barely knew. He parked near the chapel. I parked near the gate and waited, then walked in on foot, slowly, giving him enough time to get wherever he was going. I found him standing in the older section of the cemetery. The stones here were darker, some leaning slightly with age. In front of a gray marker I couldn't read from where I was, his hat in his hands, looking down, the way you stand when you're not praying exactly, but doing something adjacent to it. He stood there for maybe 20 minutes. Then he crouched down. This was a 60-year-old man, and it took him a moment to get back up and arrange something at the base of the stone. Flowers, I thought. Then he put his hat back on and straightened and walked back to his car. I didn't speak to him. I let him go, watched the car leave the car park, and then walked over to the grave he'd been standing at. I read the name. It meant nothing to me. A woman I'd never heard of, a stone marker with 2 dates I'd barely registered. I was mostly thinking, at that moment, about how to make sense of what I'd just seen, whether there was an innocent explanation I was missing, whether this was some old colleague, some family friend I'd never been told about. I went home, and I didn't say anything to my father the next Sunday when we spoke, and I didn't say anything the Sunday after that. And after a while the silence on my end had gone on long enough that breaking it would have meant explaining why I'd waited, which would have meant explaining that I'd followed him, which felt like a more complicated conversation than I was ready to have. So I let it go. I carried it the way you carry things you're not ready to ask about. Not consciously, not every day, but there, in the background, the way a sound you've stopped being able to hear is still technically present. 27 years went by. My father died in the spring, at 89, in the red brick house, in his own bed, quickly and without too much suffering, which he'd said to me once was all he was hoping for. My wife and I drove to the house 2 days later to begin sorting through things, the slow and intimate work of a life reduced to its objects. He was a tidy man, not Spartan, but organized, everything labeled, the kind of order that turns out to be an act of consideration toward whoever has to go through it afterward. The study was the most personal room, books, files, a desk with a top drawer that locked, the key sitting next to it on the desk in a small dish, as though he'd known I'd be looking and wanted to make it easy. Inside the drawer was a receipt book. Old, the cardboard cover worn soft at the corners, the kind you buy at any stationer's. I opened it without thinking much about it, expecting bills, records, the ordinary documentation of a quiet life. The receipts inside were all from the same florist, all for the same amount, all dating back to 1971. Once a year, every year, for over 50 years. The date on each one was always the same, the week of my birthday. And next to the florist's stamp on each receipt, in my father's handwriting, always the same 3 letters, E.M. I sat with the receipt book in my lap for a long time. Then I went to the cemetery. Her name was Eleanor Marsh, born 1928. I stood at the grave and read the second date, and then stood very still, because the second date was 1963, October 1963, and October 1963 was when I was born. Not the same day, 3 days after. She died 3 days after my birthday, in the same month, in the same year I came into the world. I drove to the county records office the following week. Death certificates are public records. Anyone can request them with enough patience and the right form. The clerk who helped me was young, efficient, clearly accustomed to people arriving at this particular office with something specific and unnerving on their minds, and she pulled up Eleanor Marsh without any visible reaction and printed the certificate and slid it across the counter and went back to her work. I took it to a bench in the corridor and sat down and read it. Cause of death, postpartum hemorrhage. Complications following childbirth. She had died 3 days after giving birth. I folded the certificate very carefully and put it in my jacket pocket. I walked out of the building. I sat in the car park for I don't know how long, looking at the dashboard, doing arithmetic I didn't want to do but couldn't stop doing. A woman born in 1928. A woman who died in October 1963, 3 days after giving birth. A woman my father had left flowers for, quietly, on the week of my birthday, for 52 years, without ever once mentioning her name to me. I wasn't ready to say out loud, even to myself, what the arithmetic was suggesting. Instead, I drove back to my father's house and went back into the study and opened the desk drawer again and took out everything that was in it. Underneath the receipt book was a small tin box, the kind that used to hold tobacco, worn smooth from handling, with a clasp that was slightly stiff with age. Inside the box were three things. The first was a bundle of letters, tied with kitchen string, the paper yellowed and fragile at the folds. They were addressed to my father at the red brick house, in a handwriting I'd never seen before, a loose, forward-leaning hand. The ink faded to a pale brown. I didn't read them all then. I read the first one and the last one, and that was enough. The first was from early 1963, warm and intimate in a way that made it immediately clear what the relationship had been. The last was dated September 1963, a month before my birthday, and it was shorter than the others, and it contained a sentence near the end. Asterisk, I've decided to name him after you if it's a boy, though I suppose you'll change it. I know we said I'd give him to you and Joan after, but I just want you to know I want to name him something first. Give him that, at least, asterisk. I went back to the bundle later, after I'd had time with the other things in the box, and read all the letters in order, which took most of an afternoon. They spanned about 18 months, from early 1962 to that final one in September 1963, and they were not what I expected, though I'm not certain what I expected. I think some part of me had imagined something scandalous, dramatic, the kind of letters that get described in certain tones. They weren't like that. They were the letters of two people who were, in the plainest sense, in love, and who were also navigating something neither of them had entirely chosen and neither of them had a clean way out of. My father's name appeared in them constantly, sometimes as a term of address, sometimes as part of a longer thought, and reading it, my father's name, in a stranger's handwriting, in letters he'd kept for 60 years, had the same specific dislocation as hearing someone describe, in a language you know but aren't fluent in, something that happened to you while you were asleep. I understood what I was reading. I couldn't quite integrate it with what I already knew. I set the letters down when I'd finished and went and stood in the garden for a while. The same garden my mother had kept for 40 years, the same rose bushes, the same low stone wall along the back, and I tried to think about what it would mean to be my father, moving through that garden for decades, with the letters in the tin box in the desk drawer in the study, and the flowers at the cemetery every October, and none of it ever mentioned, to anyone, for the whole length of a long and otherwise transparent life. I set the letters down. I didn't pick up the second thing immediately. I got up and went to the kitchen and stood at the sink with the tap running, the water cold on my hands, and I stood there long enough that the water went warm and I turned it off and dried my hands on the tea towel, my father's tea towel, the same kind he'd always bought, and went back to the study. The second thing in the tin was a document. Legal, formal, dated November 1963. An adoption order, signed by a judge, transferring guardianship of an unnamed infant male from the county to Robert Calloway and Joan Calloway, both of this address. Joan's signature was on it, my mother's signature, in the neat, regular hand I'd known my whole life, on a document that transferred me, in November 1963, into the family I'd believed, without ever having a reason to question it, that I'd simply been born into. I sat with the document for a very long time. The study was quiet around me, the particular quiet of a house recently vacated, the objects all still in their places, the books on the shelves, and the receipt book in the drawer, and the tin box on the desk, all of it exactly where my father had left it, as if he'd decided, at some point in the last few years of his life, to leave the door open in exactly the way he'd kept it closed for 62 years. Joan had known. Obviously, her signature was on the document, but what Joan had known, and what Joan had felt about it, was something I would never now be able to ask her, because Joan had been gone for 22 years, and whatever she had carried alongside this, the years of raising a child she'd signed a legal document to take in, the choice she'd made to never say a word about it, not even in the 8 months between her diagnosis and her death, when there was time, technically, to say a great many things, all of that had gone with her. The third thing in the box was a photograph. Small, black and white, slightly creased at one corner. A woman I'd never seen before. Young, perhaps 30, dark hair, a direct, unguarded look at the camera of someone who doesn't know they're being photographed or doesn't mind. She was in a garden somewhere, a tree behind her, and she was laughing at something just outside the frame, her head tilted slightly. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in my father's handwriting, 2 words and a year, *Eleanor. 1962, asterisk. I set the photograph on the desk facing up and looked at it. I've looked at it many times since, studying it the way you study a face you're trying to memorize, which isn't quite the right way to describe it. I'm not trying to memorize it, exactly, because I don't think I'm going to forget it. I'm looking for something in it, I think. Something recognizable. I haven't found it yet, though I'm also not sure I'd know it if I did. She's laughing. That's mostly what I see. She's young, and she's laughing, and 3 days after giving birth to me, she died of a hemorrhage in a hospital somewhere in this county. And my father spent the next 52 years going to her grave every year on my birthday, leaving white chrysanthemums and standing with his hat in his hands, and nobody in the family knew, and I don't know what to do with any of that. I went back to the grave a second time in November, a few weeks after I'd first found it. I brought flowers, the same white chrysanthemums, because that's what my father had always brought, and I didn't know what else to bring. It seemed important to continue something, even if I couldn't say exactly what. I stood where I'd watched him stand, 27 years ago, from a distance, not knowing what I was looking at. It was cold, the same kind of October cold as that first time, and the leaves were the same color, and I stood there for roughly the same amount of time he used to stand there, though I had very different things in my head. There was one thing I hadn't noticed the first time I came alone to the grave, or rather, something I'd noticed but hadn't fully registered until I came back. The plot itself was well maintained. Not extravagantly. No elaborate landscaping. Nothing that would draw attention. But the edges were neat, and the stone had been cleaned at some point relatively recently. And there was a small perennial plant growing at the base that looked as though it had been put there deliberately, not self-seeded, the kind of low-ground cover that someone chose and planted. My father, I realized. He'd been tending this for 52 years, maintaining it, keeping it clean and cared for, making sure that Eleanor Marsh's resting place looked like a grave that was still visited, still known about, still held in someone's attention. He'd done it alone, every year, without telling anyone, including the person whose name was on the stone. There's something in that specific form of faithfulness, private, annual, entirely without witness, that I find very hard to think about directly. I can only approach it sideways, the way you look at something too bright to look it straight on. I've been thinking, in the weeks since, about what it means to carry something for 52 years the way my father carried this. Not just the grief of it, the loss of a woman he clearly loved, who died 3 days after giving birth to his son, but the daily, ongoing fact of it. Sitting across from my mother at breakfast, every morning for 40 years, knowing what she didn't know, or knowing that she knew some of it, the bare fact of the adoption, but perhaps not the visits, not the flowers, not the yearly quiet marking of a name that was never once spoken in that house. I don't know whether my mother knew about the cemetery. I don't know whether my father ever told her about the flowers. There are things between two people that never make it into any document, any letter, any formal record. Things that exist only in the room between them, in the particular quality of a silence that has been agreed upon over decades without ever being named. I've been thinking about my mother differently since finding the tin box. She was 30 when she signed that document. My father would have told her something, by then, about where I'd come from. She signed a legal document with full knowledge of what it was, but what she'd known and what she'd felt about it, and how she'd arrived at the decision to take in a child whose existence was, in some way, evidence of something she hadn't been told about in advance. I'll never know any of that, and I think that might be the part that I'm going to sit with for the longest. She raised me for 40 years. She knew where I came from, in the basic factual sense, and she never once, not in 40 years, not in the 8 months of her illness when she could have, said anything. I used to think, when I thought about it at all, that my mother had no secrets, that she was simply the person she appeared to be, steady, clear, completely present. I was wrong about that too, it seems. She was simply carrying her secrets more gracefully than I knew to look for. I find myself, sometimes, looking back at specific moments with my mother and trying to understand them differently. There was one in particular. I must have been about 8, when she came into my room to say goodnight and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment longer than usual, just looking at me in the dim light, the way parents do sometimes without any clear reason. I asked her what she was doing, and she said, "Just looking at you." And when I asked why, she said, "Because sometimes that's enough." I thought nothing of it at the time. Children accept things like that as ordinary. Now I think about what it might have meant. A woman who had made a choice, 8 years earlier, on a piece of legal paper, to love a child that hadn't come from her, looking at the result of that choice in a darkened room, deciding, for the 500th or 5,000th time, that it was still the right one. I don't know if that's what she was thinking. I'm putting words to something I'll never have words for. But I think about it. I think about it more than almost anything else. I told my wife what I'd found. I told my son, who's 34 and handled it, in the way of his generation, with more equanimity than I managed. I haven't told anyone else. My father had no siblings left to tell. Joan had a sister, long dead. There's no one left who was there for any of it. No one alive who knew Eleanor Marsh, who knew what happened in October 1963, who could tell me anything more than what's in the tin box and the grave marker and the 52 years of florist receipts, which turn out to be, in the end, the most thorough record my father kept of anything in his life. My birthday came again last month. 62 years old, and the first birthday of my life during which I knew what else it was. The two things that happened in October 1963 in the same week, on either side of 3 days, my beginning and Eleanor Marsh's end. I drove to the cemetery in the afternoon, after lunch, the same way my father used to drive away from our house at about 3 o'clock with his errands. I took white chrysanthemums, the same as last time, the same as 52 times before. I crouched down at the base of the stone. It took me a moment, the same as it had taken my father at 60, and set them in the metal holder that he must have put there himself, years ago, the same one every time. I straightened up and stood with my hands in my pockets and looked at her name and her 2 dates, the same as I'd stood the first time, except that now I knew why he'd always come, and what he'd been doing, and what it was that he'd been unable to let go of, even for a year, even after 50 years, not once. I thought, standing there, about what it means to be grateful for a life you received without consenting to receive it. Eleanor Marsh didn't choose to die in October 1963. My father didn't choose to lose her. My mother Joan didn't choose, exactly, the circumstances that led to her signing that document, though she chose what she did with those circumstances, which is a different thing and perhaps the more significant one. And I didn't choose any of it. Not the October date, not the red brick house, not the woman in the 4th grade classroom who looked at me in the dark and said, because sometimes that's enough. None of us choose where we begin. We only choose, over and over, what we do with where we find ourselves. And my father's answer, for 52 years, was to drive to a cemetery in October and stand at a stone with his hat in his hands. And I think that was the best answer he knew how to give, and I'm not going to be the one to say it was wrong. I didn't know what to say, standing there. I still don't, really. I'm not someone who talks to graves, as a rule, and I wasn't sure whether whatever I might say would be addressed to Eleanor, or to my father, or to some version of myself that no longer quite exists, the one who had a birthday every October for 61 years without knowing what else that day was the other side of. In the end, I didn't say anything. I just stood there until I felt ready to leave, the way my father had stood, and then I walked back to the car the way he'd always walked back to his, and I drove home. I didn't have errands to run. There's no one waiting for me to explain where I've been. But I think I understand, now, why he never explained it, and why it took the shape it did, the consistent, private, yearly marking of something that couldn't be shared without changing everything else, carried in the only form that left everything else intact. I don't know whether that was the right way to carry it. I'm not sure I'm going to be the one to decide. I'll go again next year. I think I'll go every year. Not because it's an obligation, or because I feel I owe it to anyone. Eleanor Marsh has been in the ground for 62 years, and whatever she is now, I don't think she's keeping track of the chrysanthemums. I'll go because my father went, for 52 years, without anyone knowing, and now that I know, it seems wrong to let it stop, the same way it would seem wrong to stop winding a clock you've only just discovered has been running this whole time. Next October, I'll be 63. Eleanor Marsh will have been gone for 63 years. My father will have been gone for 2. And I'll park at the gate, and walk to the older section, and crouch down at the gray stone, and put the flowers in the holder, and stand there with my hat in my hands. I've started wearing a hat, this year, which I've never done before in my life, and stay for as long as it takes, and then walk back to the car. That's the whole of it. I don't have anything more than that yet, but I think that's enough for now.